So now that we've talked all about screening and the numbers behind it and all the calculations, I wanted to share a little bit about screening policy with you. Screening policy starts with having a recommendation based on evidence. So if we have recommendations for certain things and they've been established as being important for that particular disease, having a positive impact on decreasing the severity or the consequences of it, then we can show that we need to have policy in place in order to help prevent that in our larger population. So if you go to the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, so U.S. Preventive Services Task Force.org, under recommendations, you can see some of the published final recommendations. These recommendations also periodically come up for review, so then those will be in the recommendations in progress, and sometimes we even come up with new categories of things that we want to evaluate that maybe we didn't think of screening for in the past. So let's go to published final recommendations, and what you'll see is that we have a list of about 100. So of 98, we would have to screen through all of these in order to see all of them. But here we have the published recommendations, and you can see there are just a really wide variety of different topics. Aspirin use, screening for bacteria in the urine, autism, bacterial vaginosis, bladder cancer. And if you look over here on the right-hand side, you'll see that there are some different ways of classifying these. First of all, I like to point out that screening is just one of the kinds of preventive services. You'll see it's probably the most common one, but there is also counseling and preventive medications. You could click on those and narrow your search. You can also search by age group, you can search by gender, or by category. And so we're going to start thinking a lot more about mental health conditions and substance abuse. And so let's go ahead and click on that. And what that does is it narrows the search only to things in that particular category. And you'll see tobacco smoking cessation, illicit drug use screening, depression in children, and so forth. So the two that we'll be focusing on are the things that are the most common, alcohol misuse and depression in adults. And so if you were to click on either of these, you'll notice that in the alcohol misuse, there's both a recommendation for screening and counseling. And if you go down here to the actual recommendation, here for adults age 18 and older, the U.S. Preventive Service Task Force recommends that clinicians screen adults age 18 and older for alcohol misuse and provide persons engaged in risky or hazardous drinking with brief behavioral counseling interventions. Now, if you're not familiar with the task force grades, then I would recommend clicking on what's this. They're basically grades A for strongly recommend, B for recommends, C is neither recommends nor advises against. It's kind of like on the fence. D actually has enough evidence to recommend against that particular service, and I means that there is not enough evidence. It's insufficient evidence to be able to even evaluate that, so that we don't have enough studies on that particular topic. So this is a B recommendation. They do recommend that clinicians screen and offer counseling. If you wanted more information than just this little short thing, you could click on the PDF version for that. And there's other information embedded in this particular page. If we were to go back to the page for behavioral and addictions, we could also click on depression in adults, and this is a screening recommendation. So the task force does recommend screening for depression in the general adult population, including pregnant and postpartum women. It should be implemented with adequate systems in place to ensure accurate diagnosis. In other words, we need to have a good screening tool that has good sensitivity and specificity, positive predictive value and negative predictive value. We want there to be treatment that will actually impact the path of that person's depression, and appropriate follow-up. And so all of these things are important to having a screening program. So again, you can click on the clinical summary here and other information. So I'd recommend that you just take a kind of a quick tour of some of the other things that you may be interested in. The thing to remember about this task force is that what they've done is they've taken the evidence that's out there and they've condensed it down so that there is a consensus about that evidence. One study might show a positive result and another study might show a negative result, but if you have the vast majority of studies that have happened that show this positive relationship, then you can conclude that this particular screening or counseling or preventive medication will help the population. Often then, that recommendation that says we should be doing this, either an A or a B, translates into policy that says insurance companies need to cover that particular preventive service as part of the services that are covered for a given person. So knowing that the evidence supports it, having a U.S. preventive service recommendation then can translate into people actually receive that preventive service. So that's the connection between screening and policy. So the policies that are made around screening of what's required to be included in a person's health plan. So thank you for joining me about screening policy.